A boarding pass isn't just a piece of paper, it's a contract, a promise of a seat you paid for. For 17-year-old Jamal Hayes, his first-class ticket was more than that. It was a symbol of a dream taking flight. He was on his way to an exclusive aerospace engineering internship, a future genius in the making. But when the pilot of Oceanic Airlines Flight 732 looked at his ticket, he didn't see a promising young mind. He saw a problem. What happened next wasn't just a downgrade. It was an act of public humiliation that would ignite a firestorm, costing an airline millions, and proving that sometimes the biggest storms begin with a single act of prejudice. The crisp, cool air of the first-class cabin was a world away from the bustling terminal of Los Angeles International Airport. For 17-year-old Jamal Hayes, it felt like stepping into the future. He clutched his boarding pass for Oceanic Airlines Flight 732 to Boston, like it was the deed to a kingdom. And in a way, it was. The ticket, a generous gift from the prestigious Massachusetts Institute of Technology, was his official welcome into the elite summer program for aerospace engineering prodigies. Jamal had earned this. He wasn't just a kid who liked planes. He was a kid who built them. In his garage, amidst the scent of oil and metal, sat a fully functional, scaled-down jet engine he'd designed and constructed from scratch. His project had not only won the National Science Fair, but had also caught the attention of MIT's most celebrated professor, Dr. Alastair Finch. This flight, this seat, 1A, a window seat with a panoramic view of the wing, was the culmination of years of tireless work, of late nights spent sketching blueprints and early mornings testing thrust ratios. He found his seat with a quiet reverence, the plush leather sighing as he settled in. He stowed his sleek carbon fiber backpack, which contained his laptop, and a folder thick with schematics into the overhead bin. A flight attendant with a practiced plastic smile offered him a pre-departure orange juice. First time in first class, she asked, her tone a little too sweet. "Yes, ma'am," Jamal said, his voice brimming with an earnest politeness his parents had instilled in him. He was a tall, lanky teenager with bright, intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of his surroundings, from the brushed aluminum accents to the complex array of buttons on the armrest. He was dressed neatly in a collared shirt and chinos, an outfit he'd chosen to make a good first impression. He was so engrossed in studying the intricate mechanics of the seat's recline function that he barely noticed the man who stopped in the aisle beside him. He was older, with a stern, weathered face and a pilot's uniform that seemed to be stretched taut over a barreled chest. 4 gold stripes on his epaulets indicated his rank, captain. His name tag read, Miller. Captain Robert Miller was a man of routine and rigid order. A 25-year veteran of Oceanic Airlines, he saw the world in black and white, in right and wrong, in who belonged and who didn't. As he did before every flight, he was conducting his final walkthrough of the cabin. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, swept over the first-class passengers, a businesswoman typing on a laptop, a celebrity hiding behind sunglasses, and then they landed on Jamal. And they stayed there. Miller's gaze was sharp and accusatory, a silent interrogation that made Jamal's skin prickle. He watched as Jamal took a sip of his orange juice, his young face alight with wonder. Miller's lip curled ever so slightly. "Can I see your boarding pass?" "Son." Miller's voice was a low growl, a sound that cut through the quiet murmur of the cabin. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. Jamal, startled, fumbled for his jacket pocket where he'd put the pass. "Of course, sir." He held it out. Miller snatched it from his hand. He stared at it, then back at Jamal, then back at the ticket. He held it up to the light as if checking for a watermark, his suspicion a palpable force in the aisle. The name was there, Jamal Hayes, the seat 1A, the class first. Yet the captain's expression only hardened. There must be some kind of mistake. Miller declared, his voice loud enough for the surrounding passengers to turn and look. Jamal's heart began to beat a little faster. A mistake, sir. It was booked by the institute I'm heading to. An institute, Miller repeated, slowly dripping with condescension. He looked around, a smirk playing on his lips. Look, kid, these seats are for our premium customers, people who pay the full fare. I don't know what kind of clerical error or computer glitch put you up here, but you're going to have to move. The humiliation was a hot flash that spread from Jamal's neck to his cheeks. He was being spoken to not as a passenger, but as an intruder. But it's not a mistake, Jamal insisted, his voice wavering slightly. My name is on it. The seat number is correct. The flight attendant who had served him the juice, a woman named Aria, now hovered nearby, her expression a mixture of feigned concern and obsequious deference to the captain. Robert, is there a problem? She asked, though it was clear she was ready to back whatever her captain said. This young man seems to be under the impression that this is his seat, Miller said, waving the boarding pass dismissively. He didn't even look at Jamal, addressing the cabin at large. We have a paying customer for this seat who is likely waiting at the gate, confused. You, he finally fixed his gaze on Jamal, are going to the back of the plane where you belong. Jamal felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on him. The businesswoman looked up from her laptop, a flicker of annoyance in her expression. The celebrity just adjusted his sunglasses. No one spoke up. In that moment, Jamal wasn't a prodigy or an honored guest of MIT. In Captain Miller's eyes, he was just a black kid who couldn't possibly afford to be in first class. The golden ticket in the captain's hand suddenly felt like a forgery, and the dream it represented was rapidly turning into a nightmare. The silence in the first-class cabin was thick and suffocating. Every whisper, every rustle of a magazine seemed amplified. Jamal felt his world shrinking, collapsing into the narrow space of the aisle where he stood accused. His mind, usually so quick with calculations and solutions, was struggling to process the blatant injustice. Sir, with all due respect, this is my seat, Jamal said, his voice steadier than he felt. He reached for his backpack in the overhead bin. I have the confirmation email from MIT, the program acceptance letter. I can show you everything. Captain Miller waved a dismissive hand, a gesture of absolute authority. I don't need to see your emails, son. I need to see you out of this seat. Now. He turned to Aria, the flight attendant. Aria, find him a spot in economy. Middle seat, preferably. And be quick about it. We're on a schedule. Aria's professional smile was back in place, but it didn't reach her eyes. Right away, Captain. Sir, she said, turning to Jamal, her voice adopting a tone one might use with a troublesome child. If you'll just follow me. The word sir felt like a barb. It was the same word she'd used just minutes ago when offering him a beverage, but now it was laced with mockery. Jamal looked around the cabin, a desperate silent plea for anyone to intervene. The businesswoman was now pointedly staring at her screen. The man across the aisle was adjusting his noise-cancelling headphones. It was a masterclass in collective avoidance. They were all witnesses, yet they chose to be blind. This is completely unfair, Jamal said, his voice rising slightly. You have no right to do this. You haven't even tried to verify my ticket. Miller took a step closer, his larger frame looming over Jamal. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. I have every right. I am the captain of this aircraft. My authority is final. You can either walk back there on your own 2 feet, or I can have airport security escort you. If that happens, you won't be flying anywhere today. Do you understand me? The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Missing this flight wasn't an option. The program started the next day. An entire summer of opportunity, the first major step in his career, hinged on being on this plane. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a cold, hard knot of anger and shame. He knew he was being profiled. He knew it was wrong, but he was trapped, suspended, 30,000 feet in the air before the plane had even left the ground, caught in a web of prejudice woven by a man in a uniform. With his head held high, though his shoulders slumped with the weight of the injustice, Jamal retrieved his backpack. He cast one last look at Seat 1A, at the window that was supposed to show him the world taking off beneath him. Now it was just a symbol of a promise broken. Arya led him down the aisle, the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane, feeling like a tangible barrier between two different worlds. As he passed through a few passengers in the premium economy section, glanced up their curiosity, piqued by the silent procession of the grim-faced flight attendant and the dejected-looking black teenager. The journey to the back of the plane felt like a mile-long walk of shame. Arya navigated the crowded economy cabin with practiced ease, her eyes scanning the rows. "Here we are," she announced with false brightness, stopping at row 38. 38B, right between these two gentlemen. It was the dreaded middle seat. On one side, a large man was already spilling over the armrest sound, asleep and snoring softly. On the other, a nervous-looking student was furiously typing on his laptop, his elbows jutting out. Jamal squeezed himself into the cramped space, his knees pressed against the seat in front of him. The luxurious legroom of 1A was a distant memory. The air here was stale, thick with the scent of recycled air and cheap coffee. Arya leaned in, her smile gone, replaced by a stern warning. "Don't cause any more trouble," she whispered, before turning and disappearing back toward the front of the plane. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, Jamal leaned his head back against the uncomfortable seat, closing his eyes. The humiliation burned behind his eyelids. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about the assumption, the public accusation, the utter dismissal of him as a person. Captain Miller hadn't just taken his seat. He had tried to take his dignity. He had looked at Jamal Hayes, a brilliant young scholar, with a future as bright as a supernova, and had seen nothing more than a problem to be moved to the back of the bus. But as the engines roared to life, and the plane finally lifted off the ground, a different feeling began to replace the shame. It was a cold, quiet resolve. Captain Miller thought he had won. He thought he had put a kid in his place. He had no idea he had just made the biggest mistake of his entire career. While Jamal was being exiled to the back of the plane, not everyone in first class had been so quick to look away. In seat 2C, directly across the aisle from Jamal's original seat, sat Sarah Collins. A partner at one of Boston's most formidable civil rights law firms, Sarah was a woman whose entire career was built on seeing what others chose to ignore. In her late 40s, with sharp, perceptive eyes, and a mind that was always methodically assembling facts, Sarah had initially dismissed the interaction as a simple ticketing mix-up. But as Captain Miller's tone grew more aggressive and his language more loaded, "Where you belong, clerical error," her legal instincts flared. She saw the scene not just as an uncomfortable social moment, but as a textbook case of consumer racial profiling. She watched the captain's body language, the puffed-out chest, the intimidating proximity. She watched the flight attendant's complicity, her eagerness to placate the captain at the expense of the passenger. Most importantly, she watched Jamal's face, the initial confusion, the flash of hurt, and the final dignified retreat. It was a story she had seen play out in countless depositions and courtrooms, but seeing it unfold so brazenly in person sent a chill down her spine. As Arya led Jamal away, Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt. "Excuse me, Captain," she said, her voice calm, but carrying an undeniable note of authority. Miller, who had been basking in the quiet approval of having handled the situation, turned to her, his irritation barely concealed. "Yes." "I couldn't help but overhear," Sarah began, choosing her words carefully. "It seems highly irregular to remove a passenger who presents a valid boarding pass for his assigned seat without so much as checking your own manifest. Did you confirm with the gate that there was another passenger assigned to seat 1A? Miller's eyes narrowed. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned, especially not by a female passenger. "Ma'am, the operational command of this aircraft is my responsibility. I made a judgment call based on my experience." "Experience," Sarah countered, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Experience in what exactly? Identifying people who look like they don't belong in first class, because that's certainly what it looked like from over here." A few other passengers shifted uncomfortably. The celebrity lowered his sunglasses to get a better look. Miller's face flushed a deep red. "I'm not going to debate my command decisions with you. This is a matter of airline security and procedure." "Is it Oceanic Airlines' procedure to publicly humiliate a teenager?" Sarah pressed her voice, remaining level. "Because if it is, I think your shareholders, not to mention the Federal Aviation Administration, might be very interested to know that. I'd like your name and employee number, and the flight attendants as well." The captain was momentarily stunned into silence. He had expected a quick, clean resolution. He had not expected to be challenged by a woman who spoke with the precision of a litigator. Arya, seeing her captain faltering, stepped in. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We are preparing for takeoff." Miller seized the opportunity to regain control. "This conversation is over," he snapped, before turning on his heel and striding toward the cockpit, his back ramrod straight. Sarah knew she couldn't press the issue further without delaying the flight and potentially being removed herself. She sat back down, but the fight was far from over. She took out a sleek silver pen and a small leather-bound notebook from her briefcase. With meticulous detail, she began to write. She noted the date and flight number, Oceanic 732, September 15th. She wrote down the captain's name, Miller, and a detailed description of him. She described Arya, the flight attendant. She documented the entire exchange, quoting the captain's words, verbatim, "Where you belong. Computer glitch." She noted the exact time of the incident and the lack of intervention from any other crew member. She was no longer just a passenger. She was a witness compiling evidence. Her mind was already racing ahead, formulating legal arguments, citing precedents. This wasn't just poor customer service. It was a potential violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which guarantees all persons the same right to make and enforce contracts, including a contract of carriage with an airline. For the next 5 hours, as the plane cruised across the country, Sarah felt a growing sense of purpose. She had a full docket waiting for her in Boston, but this case, this boy, had just jumped to the top of her list. When the plane landed at Logan International Airport, she watched as the first-class passengers disembarked. She waited patiently. Finally, she saw Jamal making his way from the back of the plane, his face a stoic mask. He looked tired and profoundly disheartened. Sarah stepped into the aisle, intercepting him before he reached the jet bridge. "Excuse me," she said gently. "My name is Sarah Collins. I was in seat 2C. I saw what happened." Jamal looked at her, his guard up. "It's fine," he mumbled, trying to move past. "No," Sarah said, holding his gaze. "It is not fine. What that captain did was unprofessional, discriminatory, and very likely illegal." She held out a business card. "I'm a lawyer. I specialize in civil rights cases. When you're ready, I want you to call me. You don't have to go through this alone." Jamal stared at the card. Collins and Ward, LLP. Civil rights litigation. For the first time since he'd been ordered from his seat, a flicker of hope ignited within him. He took the card, his fingers closing around the thick, embossed paper. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "Don't thank me yet," Sarah replied with a small, determined smile. "Let's make them pay for it first." The first few days at MIT were a blur for Jamal. He was thrown into a world of quantum physics lectures, advanced propulsion labs, and late-night study sessions with students who were just as brilliant and passionate as he was. The program was everything he had dreamed of and more. He was in his element, surrounded by the language of science and innovation. But beneath the surface of his excitement, the humiliation of Flight 732 festered like a wound. Every time he saw an airplane streak across the Cambridge sky, his stomach would clench. The memory of Captain Miller's sneer of the collective indifference of the other passengers would play on a loop in his mind. He tried to push it down, to focus on his work, but the injustice of it all was a distraction he couldn't shake. He finally called his parents, David and Maria Hayes. He had initially downplayed the incident, not wanting to worry them. But now the story came pouring out, the captain's accusatory tone, the walk of shame to the back of the plane, the feeling of being utterly powerless. On the other end of the line, Maria, a high school principal, with a fierce sense of justice, listened in stony silence. David, a software engineer with a calm and methodical nature, asked pointed questions, gathering facts like lines of code. By the time Jamal finished, they were both seething. "This is not something we are going to let go of." "Jamal," Maria said, her voice tight with anger. "This isn't about a seat on a plane. This is about your right to exist in a space you have earned, to be treated with dignity." "Your mother is right," David added. "Oceanic Airlines has a responsibility here. The captain is their employee. They are liable for his actions." It was then that Jamal remembered the business card tucked away in his wallet. "There was someone," he said, pulling it out. "A woman in first class. She saw everything. She's a lawyer." The name Sarah Collins was a spark in the darkness. David Hayes immediately looked up Collins and Ward, LLP. The firm's reputation was impeccable. They were known as giant slayers, a small but powerful firm that took on major corporations and government entities in the name of civil rights, and won. The next day, the Hayes family, with Jamal on speakerphone from his dorm room, had a conference call with Sarah Collins. Jamal recounted the story again, this time with the added clarity of a few days' distance. Sarah listened patiently, interjecting only to ask for specific details. Did he ever check the manifest? No. Did he consult with the gate agent? No. Did any other passenger in first class have a ticket for 1A? Not that I know of. The seat remained empty for the entire flight. That last detail was the nail in the coffin. The seat hadn't been double-booked. There was no confused passenger waiting at the gate. Captain Miller's entire justification was a lie, a flimsy pretext for a discriminatory act. "We have a very strong case," Sarah stated, her voice resonating with confidence. "This is a clear violation of 49 U.S. Code, Paragala 4127, which prohibits air carriers from discriminating against passengers on the basis of race. What Captain Miller did was not a judgment call. It was a baseless, racially motivated abuse of power." She laid out the strategy. First, they would send a formal complaint and a demand letter to Oceanic Airlines corporate headquarters and their general counsel. They would demand a formal apology, the immediate termination of Captain Miller and flight attendant Aria, and a significant monetary settlement for the emotional distress and public humiliation inflicted upon Jamal. "And if they refuse?" David asked. "Then we file a lawsuit," Sarah said without hesitation. "We take them to federal court. We will request their training manuals, their records of passenger complaints, and Captain Miller's full-service history through the discovery process. We will put their entire corporate culture on trial." The Hayes family agreed. This was no longer just about Jamal. It was about sending a message. David and Maria knew this fight would be expensive and emotionally draining, but they were prepared. They had raised their son to believe in himself, and they would be damned if they let a man like Robert Miller tear that down. 2 weeks later, the response from Oceanic Airlines arrived. It was a sterile 2-paragraph letter from their legal department. It acknowledged receipt of their complaint, stated that they had conducted an internal review of the incident, and concluded that their staff had acted in accordance with standard airline procedures. They offered Jamal a $500 travel voucher for the inconvenience. There was no apology, no mention of disciplinary action, just a dismissive, insulting voucher. Sarah read the letter over the phone to the Hayes family. The silence on the other end was heavy. $500? Maria finally said, her voice dripping with contempt. "That's what they think my son's dignity is worth." "It's their opening salvo," Sarah explained. "They're trying to intimidate us to make us go away cheap. They're betting that a 17-year-old kid and his family don't have the stomach for a real fight. They have no idea who they're dealing with." "So what's the next step?" David asked, his voice firm. Sarah's reply was simple and chilling. "The next step is war. I'm filing the lawsuit tomorrow morning. Hayes v. Oceanic Airlines, Inc." The storm had gathered, and now it was about to break. Filing the lawsuit was like firing a cannon shot across the bow of a battleship. Oceanic Airlines, a multi-billion-dollar corporation with a fleet of lawyers on retainer, responded with predictable arrogance. Their initial motion was to have the case dismissed, claiming it was frivolous, and that a captain's authority in flight was nearly absolute. The judge, a seasoned federal magistrate named Evelyn Reed, denied their motion, flatly stating that the allegations, if true, suggested a profound and disturbing abuse of authority. The case moved into the discovery phase, and this was where Sarah Collins truly shone. She was relentless, a legal bloodhound on the scent of corporate malfeasance. She buried Oceanic's legal team in a mountain of subpoenas and requests for production. She asked for everything: Captain Miller's complete personnel file, every passenger complaint ever filed against him, the flight and cabin crew logs for Flight 732, and Oceanic's internal training materials on discrimination and passenger rights. Oceanic's lawyers fought back, filing objections and attempting to stonewall at every turn. But Sarah was prepared for their tactics. She filed motions to compel, and Judge Reed, growing increasingly impatient with the airline's evasiveness, granted them. The corporate fortress of Oceanic Airlines was being forced to open its gates. What they found was damning. Captain Miller's file was a tapestry of red flags. Over his 25-year career, he had been the subject of 12 formal passenger complaints. 9 of those complaints were filed by people of color. The allegations were strikingly similar: baseless accusations, an aggressive and demeaning tone, and an abuse of his authority over trivial matters. The airline had investigated each one with a cursory internal review, and had cleared Miller of any wrongdoing every single time. It was a clear pattern of behavior enabled by a corporate culture that consistently protected its own. They also deposed Aria, the flight attendant. On the stand, under Sarah's methodical questioning, her polished composure began to crack. She claimed she was just following the captain's orders, a defense that Sarah dismantled with surgical precision. "Ms. Wallace," Sarah asked, referring to Aria by her last name, "Oceanic's own training manual, which I have here as exhibit, C states that cabin crew have a duty to de-escalate conflicts and ensure all passengers are treated with respect. Did you feel Captain Miller was treating Mr. Hayes with respect? Arya hesitated. The captain was concerned about a ticketing discrepancy. That's not what I asked, Sarah pressed. Did his tone calling a 17-year-old son in a condescending manner, telling him to go where you belong, strike you as respectful? I was focused on resolving the situation quickly, Arya stammered. By resolving, you mean removing a ticketed passenger from his paid-for seat based on nothing more than the captain's whim, Sarah shot back. Did you at any point suggest to the captain that you should verify the ticket with the gate agent before taking such a drastic step? No, I did not. Why not? Because he's the captain, Arya said weakly. The deposition painted a clear picture of a complicit employee who chose to enable discrimination rather than follow her own company's protocol. The most crucial part of the discovery, however, was the deposition of Jamal Hayes. Oceanic's lead attorney, a slick corporate lawyer named Marcus Thorne, planned to paint Jamal as an angry, entitled teenager looking for a payday. He thought he could trip him up, make him seem unreliable. He was sorely mistaken. Jamal, who flew to Boston for the deposition, walked into the conference room with a quiet confidence that unnerved Thorne. He was no longer just a kid who built engines. He was a young man who had spent months preparing for this day with Sarah. He answered every question with precision and honesty. Thorne began with a patronizing line of questioning. Mr. Hayes, you were quite excited about this trip, weren't you? First time in first class, a big program at MIT. It must have been a huge disappointment to be moved. It was humiliating. Jamal corrected him, his voice even. It had nothing to do with disappointment about the seat, and everything to do with being publicly accused of something I didn't do based on the color of my skin. Thorne tried to twist his words. So you're claiming you know what was in Captain Miller's mind, that you're a mind reader. I don't need to be a mind reader, Jamal replied calmly. The seat was empty for the entire 5-hour flight. If he truly believed it was double-booked, he would have checked. He didn't. The only variable that distinguished me from the other passengers in that cabin was my race. That is not an assumption. It is a logical deduction based on the evidence. Jamal's intellect was his greatest weapon. He spoke with the clarity of a scientist and the conviction of someone telling the absolute truth. He detailed the mechanics of the seat he had been admiring, the schematics he was carrying in his bag, and the purpose of his trip. He was not an angry kid. He was a brilliant, composed young man who had been subjected to a degrading experience. When Thorne tried to bring up a minor disciplinary issue from Jamal's middle school years, a desperate attempt to smear his character, Sarah objected so forcefully the court reporter flinched. Judge Reed, who was reviewing the deposition transcript later, would make a note of Thorne's unprofessional and irrelevant line of questioning. By the end of the day, Marcus Thorne knew his strategy was in shambles. He had underestimated Jamal Hayes. The airline had underestimated the Hayes family, and they had all profoundly underestimated Sarah Collins. The case was no longer just about one boy and one pilot. It was about a pattern of negligence and a culture of discrimination. Sarah had discovered the rot within Oceanic Airlines, and now she was ready to expose it to the world in a court of law. The air in Federal Courtroom 4B was unnaturally still heavy with the weight of expectation. For weeks, the space had been a battleground of objections, motions, and meticulously presented evidence. Now it had been distilled into this singular moment, the testimony. On one side of the room, Jamal sat between his parents, his posture straight, his gaze fixed forward. He had traded his usual casual attire for a well-fitted suit, a quiet armor for the day he would finally tell his story. Beside him, Sarah Collins was an island of tranquility, her files arranged in a precise, almost architectural stack, her focus absolute. Across the aisle, the Oceanic Airlines team projected an aura of expensive confidence. Their lead counsel, Marcus Thorne, whispered to his junior associates, a smirk playing on his lips. They viewed this as a nuisance, a public relations problem that could be managed with legal jargon and character assassination. They were about to learn, in the most public and financially painful way possible, how gravely they had miscalculated. Their first and most critical witness was Captain Robert Miller himself. As he strode to the stand, he was the very embodiment of authority. His uniform was immaculate, his silver hair was neatly combed, and his jaw was set with a confidence honed over decades of command. In his direct examination, Thorne guided him skillfully, painting him not as a bigot, but as a hero burdened by immense responsibility. "Captain," Thorne began, his voice resonating with respect, "could you describe for the jury the pressures of commanding a multi-million-dollar aircraft with hundreds of lives in your hands? It's a responsibility you live with every second." Miller said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "You're trained to constantly assess risk, to see things others don't, to make split-second decisions to ensure the safety and security of your passengers and crew. And on September 15th, on Flight 732, did you perceive a potential risk when you saw the plaintiff, Mr. Hayes, in seat 1A? "I did," Miller stated firmly. "It wasn't one specific thing. It was an instinct, a gut feeling, developed over 25 years of flying. His demeanor, his age. It felt inconsistent with the typical first-class passenger profile. There was a flicker of something that put me on alert. In my line of work, you don't ignore those feelings. I made a command decision to mitigate a potential security issue by relocating the passenger. It was a procedural judgment call, plain and simple. It had absolutely nothing to do with race." He delivered the lines with practiced conviction. To a casual observer, he sounded reasonable, prudent, even admirable. But he wasn't speaking to a casual observer. He was about to face Sarah Collins. Sarah approached the lectern not with aggression, but with a calm, almost academic curiosity. "Captain Miller," she began, her voice soft, but carrying to every corner of the room, "let's talk about that gut feeling. You've sworn under oath that your decision was based on this instinct. In your extensive training is gut feeling, listed as an approved protocol for identifying fraudulent tickets." "My training is about holistic situational awareness," Miller parried. "That's not my question," Sarah said, her tone hardening just a fraction. "Is the term gut feeling in the Oceanic Airlines operational manual for crew conduct, yes or no?" "No," he conceded, his jaw tightening. "So you deviated from official procedure based on a personal, undefinable emotion. An emotion that in your entire 25-year career had never once correctly identified a fraudulent first-class ticket. Is that right?" "Objection," Thorne called out, argumentative. "Sustained. Rephrase, Miss Collins," Judge Reed instructed. "Certainly," Sarah said, never taking her eyes off Miller. "Captain, let's discuss your record. Do you recall an incident in May 2019 on a flight to Tokyo involving a Mr. Kenji Tanaka, a Japanese tech executive whom you reported to the crew as suspicious because he was overly quiet?" Miller paled slightly. "I recall the flight. And do you recall the incident in December 2021 involving the Al-Jamil family, whom you insisted have their carry-on luggage re-screened at the gate because they were speaking a foreign language too loudly? A complaint was filed, was it not?" Each question was a precise jab, chipping away at his facade of professional impartiality. She brought up 4 more incidents, each involving a passenger of color, each stemming from Miller's instincts. The pattern was undeniable, a clear history of racial and ethnic profiling masquerading as security concerns. "Now, Captain," Sarah said, moving in for the final strike. "You testified that you believed the seat was double-booked, yet you never once used your radio to call the gate agent to confirm this. Did you?" I was on a tight schedule. A 30-second radio call was too much for you, but publicly confronting and humiliating a teenager in front of a full cabin was an efficient use of your time. Her voice dripped with incredulity. "Captain, the truth is you didn't check because you didn't care if it was true. You saw a young black man in a seat you felt he didn't deserve, and you created a lie to remove him. That's what really happened, isn't it?" Miller sputtered his face, a mask of crimson fury, but the damage was done. His credibility was in ashes. The trial's fulcrum, however, was Jamal's testimony. When he took the stand, he spoke not with anger, but with a devastating clarity. Sarah guided him gently. "Jamal, tell the jury what you were thinking when you first sat in seat 1A. "I was thinking about the physics of it," Jamal said, his voice resonating with a quiet passion. "I was looking at the wing, at the flaps and ailerons. I was thinking about Bernoulli's principle about the complex engineering that allows a 400-ton machine to fly. I felt connected to it. I was on my way to MIT to learn how to build the next generation of these machines. That seat wasn't just a luxury for me, it was the front row to my future." He then described the confrontation not as a simple argument, but as a methodical dismantling of his identity. He didn't see an aspiring engineer. He didn't see a student. He didn't even see a customer, Jamal said, looking directly at the jury, his voice steady. His eyes passed over me, and the only data point he registered was my skin color. And from that single data point, he concluded I was a fraud. As a person who loves science, who believes in evidence and logic, it was the most illogical, evidence-free conclusion I had ever witnessed. He paused, taking a breath. He told me to go, where I belong, to Bohus. And with those 4 words, he tried to erase my acceptance to MIT, my science fair awards, all the years of hard work. He tried to put me in a box. The humiliation wasn't about moving seats. It was about being told that my achievements weren't enough to overcome someone's prejudice. His testimony was profound. He had taken their ugly, baseless accusation and dissected it with the same intellectual rigor he applied to an engine schematic. When he was finished, a heavy silence fell upon the courtroom. The jury saw not a victim seeking a payday, but a future leader who had been wronged. Sarah's closing argument was a masterclass. She wove the threads together, Miller's history, the airline's negligence, the complicity of the crew, and the profound dignity of Jamal. For years, Oceanic Airlines had a problem in their cockpit. She declared, her voice ringing with conviction. Captain Miller was a recurring error in their system. They saw the warning lights complaint after complaint, and they chose to ignore them to clear his record to keep him in command. On September 15th, that systemic failure resulted in the public humiliation of an exceptional young man. They want you to believe this was a minor inconvenience. But we are here to tell them that dignity is not a minor detail. She gestured towards Jamal. They offered him a $500 voucher. Today, you, the jury, get to decide the real price of prejudice. You get to send a message not just to Oceanic, but to every corporation that thinks it can hide its discrimination behind a uniform and a title. Tell them what a young man's future is worth. The jury deliberated for only 90 minutes. When they returned, the tension was a physical presence in the room. Jamal's mother gripped his hand so tightly he could feel her pulse. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, handed the verdict to the clerk. The clerk's voice was flat, clinical. On the charge of racial discrimination, we the jury find for the plaintiff, Jamal Hayes. A choked sob escaped from Maria Hayes. And what damages do you award? Judge Reed prompted. The clerk cleared her throat. We award the plaintiff $500,000 in compensatory damages for emotional distress and $10 million in punitive damages against Oceanic Airlines. $10.5 million. The number echoed in the silent courtroom like a thunderclap. Marcus Thorne dropped his pen. It clattered on the polished table. Jamal felt a wave of dizziness as his father's arm wrapped around his shoulders. He looked at Sarah, who gave him a slow, triumphant nod. It was over. Justice hadn't been denied. It had been delivered with a force that would create shockwaves far beyond the walls of this courtroom. The moment the clerk announced the $10 million punitive damage award, the sterile quiet of the courtroom shattered. It was as if a soundproof barrier had been breached. Gasps echoed off the wood-paneled walls, followed by a wave of frantic murmurs from the gallery. For a suspended second, Marcus Thorne and the entire Oceanic legal team were frozen, their faces a collective portrait of disbelief. The smirk Thorne had worn for weeks had vanished, replaced by a ghastly, pale shock. The battleship of their corporate defense had not just been defeated, it had been sunk, torpedoed by the simple, undeniable truth. Across the aisle, the victory was quiet and profound. Maria Hayes let out a sob she'd been holding back for months, burying her face in her husband's shoulder. David Hayes wrapped his arms around his wife and son, a silent, powerful shield of paternal pride. Jamal simply sat the weight of the ordeal lifting from him as he watched Sarah Collins slowly and deliberately pack her files. She caught his eye and gave him a smile, not one of gloating, but of deep-earned satisfaction. Justice had been done. Outside, a storm of reporters had gathered, turning the courthouse steps into a chaotic sea of cameras and microphones. Sarah, flanked by the Hayes family, gave a brief, powerful statement. Today's verdict wasn't just a victory for Jamal Hayes, she declared, her voice cutting through the noise. It was a verdict against a corporate culture that chose to protect a problematic employee over protecting the dignity of its passengers. Oceanic Airlines was given a chance to do the right thing, and they refused. Today, the jury did it for them. The story exploded. It was the lead item on every evening news broadcast. The courtroom sketches of Captain Miller's crumbling composure under Sarah's cross-examination became iconic images of exposed prejudice. Legal analysts dissected her masterful strategy, praising how she used the airline's own manuals and Miller's documented history of complaints to build an irrefutable case of systemic negligence. On social media, the story went supernova. Oceanic racism and justice for Jamal trended for days, with millions sharing Jamal's story and condemning the airline. Audio clips of Jamal's calm, intelligent testimony went viral, a powerful counter-narrative to the stereotype he had been forced to endure. For Oceanic Airlines, the fallout was an uncontrolled tailspin. The day after the verdict, Wall Street delivered its own judgment. When the opening bell rang, Oceanic's stock, OAL, plummeted. Traders dumped the stock in a frenzy, terrified of the reputational damage and the specter of future lawsuits. By noon, the airline's market value had cratered, losing nearly $1 billion, 100 times the cost of the verdict itself. Inside Oceanic's gleaming corporate headquarters, the atmosphere was one of pure panic. An emergency board meeting was convened, a grim affair of furious, red-faced executives searching for a scapegoat. The legal department, which had assured them the case was a minor nuisance, was eviscerated. The CEO, Charles Kensington, a man who had never deigned to learn Jamal Hayes' name, was forced into a humiliating public apology. He stood before a forest of cameras, reading a soulless, lawyer-vetted speech about re-evaluating our protocols and being committed to diversity. The public saw it for what it was, a desperate attempt at damage control, and the calls for his resignation began before he had even left the podium. The karma for the individuals responsible was even more direct. Captain Robert Miller received his termination notice via a cold, impersonal email from Human Resources. The letter cited the irreparable harm his actions both on the flight and his untenable testimony at the trial had caused the company. He was stripped of his seniority, his flight benefits, and the pension he had been banking on for his retirement. At 58, he was not just unemployed, he was unemployable. His name was now synonymous with corporate liability and bigotry. He tried calling old colleagues, but his calls went to voicemail. He was spotted once weeks later in a grocery store, and a teenager recognized him and silently started recording him with a phone. The man who once held absolute authority over hundreds of people in a metal tube was now a prisoner of his own infamy, haunted by the consequences of a single hateful decision. Flight attendant Aurea Wallace was also fired her choice to be a silent accomplice, costing her the career she had built. The verdict sent shockwaves through the entire aviation industry. The FAA, citing the damning evidence of negligence revealed in the trial, launched a full-scale investigation into Oceanic Airlines. The probe resulted in millions more in federal fines and a legally binding consent decree that mandated a top-to-bottom overhaul of their training and complaint handling procedures. Other airlines, seeing the $10 million writing on the wall, raced to implement their own changes. The Jamal Hayes rule became an informal industry standard, a protocol requiring a mandatory multi-source verification by both a gate agent and a supervising crew member before any passenger could be involuntarily reseated due to a ticketing dispute. A single act of injustice had ended up making the skies safer and more equitable for millions. Amidst the corporate chaos and media frenzy, Jamal remained grounded. He knew the money was a tool, a symbol of accountability, but it wasn't the true victory. With the guidance of his parents and Sarah, the Hayes family used a significant portion of the settlement to launch the Hayes Foundation for Aeronautical Advancement, an organization dedicated to providing scholarships grants and mentorship opportunities for students from underrepresented communities pursuing careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Its first public event was a small ceremony where Jamal awarded the inaugural scholarship to a brilliant young Latina high school student who had designed a new type of drone wing. In his speech, Jamal never mentioned Oceanic Airlines or Captain Miller. Instead, he spoke about the limitless potential of the human mind and the importance of ensuring that every aspiring innovator, regardless of their background, has a chance to earn their place in the cockpit, the lab, or the mission control center. He went on to excel at MIT and later earned a coveted position at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. There he didn't just build engines, he helped conceptualize and design the next generation of ion propulsion systems, the very technology that would one day carry astronauts to Mars. On launch days, as he stood in the control room, watching a rocket claw its way into the heavens, he would sometimes think back to Flight 732. He remembered the feeling of being small, of being wrongfully judged. But that memory was now eclipsed by the immense, awe-inspiring reality of what he was a part of a collective human endeavor to reach beyond the confines of our world. Captain Miller had tried to confine him to the back of a plane, but Jamal Hayes, through his resilience, intelligence, and grace, had ended up helping launch humanity to the stars. What you've just heard is a story about more than just an airline seat. It's a powerful reminder that one person's courage, amplified by the voice of justice, can challenge $1 billion corporation and spark change across an entire industry. Jamal's story shows us that dignity is not a privilege to be granted, but a right to be defended. The world is full of gatekeepers who will try to tell you where you belong, but as Jamal proved true, worth isn't determined by their prejudice, but by your own potential and resolve. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell for more real-life stories of justice and karma. What are your thoughts on the verdict? Let us know in the comments below.